Okay, so my paper is called Reimagining Heidegger, Underground Discourse Within the History of Philosophy. For Heidegger, we must imagine philosophy. If we are to imagine, in the sense of Kant's first critique, where imagination is a subjective source of cognition, we must be concerned with association and reproduction, as Kant adds parenthetically. Imagining philosophy deals in philosophic associations and reproductions, but with what is philosophy to be associated? The question of the association of philosophy is the question of the other. To imagine philosophy is to imagine the other. The text is the other of philosophy. The text is the reproduction of Heidegger and Heidegger's association with us in the history of philosophy. On the subject of the imagination in Kant's first critique, Heidegger said that, quote, pure intuition and pure thinking lead back to the transcendental power of imagination, such that, to quote again, the structure of these faculties of pure intuition and pure thinking has been rooted in the structure of the transcendental power of the imagination, so that indeed this latter can imagine something for the first time only in structural unity with those two. To imagine Heidegger's philosophy, even for the first time, is for it to appear in the confluence of thinking and intuition, our intuition of Heidegger's thought reproduced on the page, the thought of the other on the page, our thinking about the content of the intuition of the thoughts reproduced upon the page, the reproduction of the content of our intuition of the thought of Heidegger reproduced upon the page, reproduced in our thinking, reimagined. Let us think philosophy differently, think Heidegger differently, reproduced in a different context, with a different association, reimagined. I want us to think of philosophy and of Heidegger on firmer ground, in clearer air. Heidegger imagined philosophy as an examination of everyday life, an everyday life where chairs never touch the wall and hammers are accommodated by our circumspective awareness of the referential totality within which we encounter the hammer as something that can be used in order to do whatever would require a hammer in our everyday lives. What if we are not occupied with these everyday things? What if we have taken a break from the everyday? Might we take a break in the mountains, a vacation from the everyday, a change of scenery? Perhaps we have gone to the mountain to find ourselves, or to lose ourselves so that we can be found again. The narrator of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground laments that he, quote, firmly believes that not only too much consciousness, but any sort of consciousness is a disease. Paul W. Neasley has suggested that Notes from Underground takes the form of a confession that implicates the reader in the narrator's disease of consciousness. Taking up the interpretation of Notes from Underground as a confession, Sherem Lubkemen-Allen argues that the authenticity and authority of underground discourse rests upon an Orthodox community mediating a self-conscious parody wherein self-conscious and stubbornly rebellious and reflective meditations on life make possible the recovery of a moral ground on which self and other stand as autonomous, dialogically realized beings. Heidegger's philosophy confesses a nervous disorder, an anxiety that breaks down the familiarity of the world to the extent that we do not feel at home, an anxiety that gives us a sense of the uncanniness of our being, an uncanniness that unsettles us and makes the referential totalities within which we encounter such things as hammers become suddenly conspicuous and questionable. Because anxiety individualizes, it is always my own uncanniness that gets disclosed by anxiety. I too am indicted by anxiety. I too am rendered homesick with the nervous disease of consciousness expressed by the underground discourse which says, to quote Dostoevsky again, we have all lost touch with life. We are cripples, every one of us, more or less. Thus, if we too pursue the interpretation of our own confession of anxiety, of the diseased consciousness, then we, along with Heidegger, are forming an underground discourse. From where does our underground discourse with Heidegger obtain its authenticity and authority? Heidegger tells us that the possibility for our being authentic is awakened in anxiety, that to be anxious is to be able to hear a call back to our authentic selves. Does our underground discourse with Heidegger rest on an Orthodox community that mediates a self-conscious parody? Are we self-consciously and stubbornly rebellious in our reflective meditations on life, and do our attempts make possible the recovery of a moral ground on which self and others stand as autonomous, dialogically realized beings? First, we must think through the Orthodox and the Parody. In the Orthodox, orthos generally has the sense of straight, with the spatial sense of upright or standing. It can be applied to the posture of a man or to a building. In geometry, it means at right angles to, and in astrology can mean signs which rise vertically. Metaphorically, orthos is right, safe, prosperous. Orthos is true and real. It is authentic. We bring these meanings into association with doxa, understood as a notion which can be true or false, or the opinion which others have of me, my estimation, reputation, and credit, or even of the popularly formed estimation of a thing. And so we interpret orthodox as that upstanding estimation of something personal as authentic, which we can conceive as having been popularly formed. The way in which Heidegger places Kant first may be one sign of the orthodoxy we enter in our underground discourse with him. Not only is this Kantian emphasis evidenced by the famous Kant book, but also by the fact that in 1927, when Heidegger sets about deconstructing the history of metaphysics concerning the question of being, he does so by starting with the Kant's claim that being is not a real predicate. Further, in the preface to the Kant book, we find Heidegger confessing that he had, quote, glimpsed in the chapter on the schematism in the Critique of Pure Reason, a connection between the problem of being in traditional metaphysics and the phenomenon of time. In this way, the manner of questioning from being and time came into play as an anticipation of my attempt to interpret Kant. Kant's text became a refuge as I sought in Kant an advocate for the question of being I posed, end quote. Certainly, Kant's example is estimated as an upstanding personal attempt at an authentic questioning, a notion of authentic truth, and one held highly in the popular opinion of the academic community. Schopenhauer appears prophetic when he writes that, quote, only in time will the entire force and importance of Kant's doctrine become obvious, once the spirit of the times itself, gradually reshaped by the influence of that doctrine, altered in its most crucial and innermost features, come to bear living witness to the power of that colossal spirit. Hegel believed, quote, Kant rediscovered this triadic form of the movement of truth by instinct, and that, to quote again, since then it has been raised to its absolute significance, and with it the true form in its true content has been presented. More importantly for us, it is within Kant's philosophy that Heidegger takes refuge. He sought in Kant not an answer, but an advocate for the answer he himself had sought. Heidegger is still not at home in Kant. He is a refugee from his own thinking. We are similar indeed. To seek refuge in the mountain of another, the spirit of imagining philosophy, a philosophy of the imagination. In the mountain of the other, we might find ourselves again. But what of parity? Isn't Heidegger, in his refuge, in his rebellious deconstruction, where Kant is both his first refuge and target, parodying Kantian philosophy? In what sense of parity would this be true? In Linda Hutchian's work, we find a definition of parity that leads to, quote, a vision of interconnectedness, while maintaining a deliberate refusal to take our social, historical, and existential present, along with the past as referent, as ultimate objects. And yet this mode of parity, to quote, teaches and enacts the recognition of the fact that social, historical, and existential reality is discursive reality when it is used as the referent of art, and so the only genuine historicity becomes that which acknowledges its own discursive contingent identity. The past as referent is not bracketed or effaced, it is incorporated and modified, given new and different life and meaning, end quote. Applying this to Heidegger's approach to Kant, we see in Being in Time and in the Kant book precisely this kind of parity. Being in Time itself displays the rigorous Kantian architectonic in its analytic of Dasein, and yet it is a tectonic without rigid categories of Kantianism, with open and fluid existentials which are found not in pure, rarefied reason, but in the everyday life in which we find ourselves as a matter of fact, where we just are, regardless of our metaphysical commitments. Heidegger seeks, through his deconstruction, to correct that which Hegel had diagnosed as, quote, the lifeless schema and mere shadow in Kant. But is Heidegger, with his perpetual homeless Dasein, not deconstructing his own refuge? Is that not what we have done? What Dasein does? Isn't that philosophy, always seeking its own end? The end of philosophy, the end of art, the end of man, the end of subjectivity, the end of ends, the end of the end of ends. Perhaps I myself am parodying Heidegger, even writing a parody of Heidegger's parody of Kant, Perhaps I am always already writing this parody. Indeed, I am a sick man. Let me find my own mountain on which to convalesce. Kant was, for Heidegger, der Zauberberg, the magic mountain on which one could take time to find oneself again. And if Thomas Mann has taught us anything, it is that the nature of time becomes conspicuous on the magic mountain. Time became conspicuous for Heidegger and Kant. In Heidegger, time becomes conspicuous for us. To introduce a course on the duration of time, Emmanuel Levinas reminds us that, quote, Heidegger said that one cannot pose the question, what is time? Because one then immediately posits time as a being. And so we are not lost in time, we are rather lost with time. The task of being in time, if understood authentically, is to undertake the analytic of Dasein in order to recover time lost in spatiality, and thereby rediscover the meaning of being as time, historicizing the world. This is why Heidegger will later confess, quote, in being in time, Dasein still has an appearance that is anthropological, subjectivistic, individualistic, etc., and yet the opposite of all this is in view there, and that's in the Contributions to Philosophy. In Kant, Heidegger goes in search of lost time, as it were, so that, as Proust says, quote, the subject of his book would separate itself from him, leaving him free to apply himself to it or not, and at the same time his sight would return, and he would be astonished to find himself in darkness, pleasant and restful enough for his eyes, but even more perhaps for his mind, to which it appeared incomprehensible, without a cause, something dark indeed. From Swann's Way, the first volume of Recognition of Lost Time. If Heidegger's book, Being in Time, has been thus separated from him, freeing him and freed from him, then it has been freed to and for us, for our reading, even to and for our parody within the underground discourse. Thereby, any refuge sought in Heidegger is a refuge already given over to the task of seeking out the meaning of being in time, not a time wherein we will find ourselves, but rather a time calling us back to ourselves as the there of the temporalization of time itself, the historicity of the world as such, in the being of Dasein exposed to anxiety. History itself is thus the function of the disease of consciousness. Yet this is not a clinical disease. It is the dis-ease, right? Dis-ease of not being at home, of being uprooted from the social existential certainty of taking our past and present as ultimate objects. If we have ourselves deliberately refused these ultimate objects, we have already taken responsibility for the constitution of any genuine history in our own discursive contingent identities. After all, it is in anxiety that we are open to the possibility of becoming individuals. But if we have understood Heidegger, not in a subjectivistic sense, subjectivity has been drowned in the current of time. Foucault bears witness to the erasure of man's subjectivity, quote, like a face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea. We are then only individuals among the others, only myself in being with others from whom my individuality stands out, one face in a crowd. To use the words of Camus, at this limit, the we are paradoxically defines a new form of individualism. But we will not leave it at that, for Camus goes on to say, we are in terms of history, and history must reckon with this we are, which must in turn keep its place in history. I have need of others who have need of me, and of each other. Every collective action, every form of society supposes a discipline, and the individual, without discipline, is only a stranger, bowed down under the weight of an inimicable collectivity. These words of Camus resonate with Heidegger, whose Dasein was subject to the dominion, Botmässigkeit, of others in the form of the neuter das Man, in whom I lose my individuality to be subsumed in their idle chatter and curiosity, in whom I am lost, and from whom I might be called back to my authentic being myself. We might think of the supposed discipline as the practice of living with the dis-ease, with the anxiety of our own anarchic being, of our own stubbornly rebellious natures, which make possible the recovery of a moral ground on which self and others stand as autonomous dialogical beings realized in reflective meditation. We should not seek to cure such a disease. It is the chronic dis-ease of living that is the condition of the possibility of the ethical. For us, this possibility is being expressed here as the discipline of the underground discourse we have engaged with Heidegger, with Kant, which is engaged at any time we take up the history of philosophy for our own ends, anytime we imagine philosophy anew in the act of philosophizing. Having diagnosed Dasein with its chronic dis-ease, let us imagine it convalescing on Mann's magic mountain in the sanatorium at Davos Platz. In Changes, the opening section of chapter 6 of the Magic Mountain, Mann asks, quote, "What is time?" He runs into the same difficulties about which Levinas is warned. In the Magic Mountain, Mann writes, and this is a long quote, bear with me, "What is time? A secret, insubstantial and omnipotent, a prerequisite of the external world, a motion intermingled and fused with bodies existing and moving in space. Time is active. By nature it is much like a verb. It both ripens and brings forth. And what does it bring forth? Change. Now is not then, here is not there, for in both cases motion lies in between. But since we measure time by a circular motion closed in on itself, we could just as easily say that its motion and change are rest and stagnation, for the then is constantly repeated in the now, the there and the here. Moreover, since, despite our best desperate attempts, we cannot imagine an end to time or a finite border around space, we have decided to think of them as eternal and infinite, in the apparent belief that even if we are not totally successful, this marks some improvement. But does not the very positing of eternity and infinity imply the logical mathematical negation of things limited and finite, their relative reduction to zero? Is a consequence of events possible in eternity? Is a juxtaposition of objects possible in infinity? How does our makeshift assumption of eternity and infinity square with concepts like distance, motion, change, or even the very existence of a finite body in space? Now there's a real question for you." End quote. These are the kinds of questions that trouble Hans Castorp just by being there. He goes to the sanatorium to visit his cousin, but as a man who, quote, "lives not only his personal life as an individual, but also consciously or unconsciously the lives of his epoch and contemporaries, and although he may regard the general and impersonal foundations of his existence as unequivocal and take them for granted, having as little intention of ever subjecting them to critique as our good Hans Castorp himself had, it is nevertheless quite possible that he senses his own moral well-being to be somehow impaired by the lack of critique." End quote. So being such a man, Hans Castorp eventually feels the anxiety arising from that lack of critique, and his dis-ease evinced itself in its outward appearance, which ultimately leads him to prolong his stay at the sanatorium time and time again, ultimately for 7 years. He becomes increasingly inclined to ask the sorts of questions regarding time detailed above, and falls under the sway of two opposing schools of thought championed by Settembrini and Nafta. Now, dislodged from his everyday home, down in the flatlands, and sequestered in the Alps, Hans has time to take a critical stance on the beliefs and values, the social customs and ways of life he lived before and took for granted, and began to notice a variety of problems with that world, down below, as it were, the world of his everyday life. His alpine life is a respite from that, but he is still a visitor, a stranger there. He shelters in the company of Settembrini and Nafta, who engage his newfound critical state of mind with gusto. However, still unsettled, Hans has an ironic distance from the ideologies of these two interlocutors as well, for their respective ideologies, while each critical and questioning in their own ways, were nevertheless still a composition of the various ways of life, of politics, religion, and habits from the lives each interlocutor had themselves lived before coming to the mountains. From his state of detachment, Hans muses, quote, "Confusion reigned. Objective reality, shouted one. The self, cried the other. Finally, one side was talking about art, and the other about criticism, and both constantly returned to nature and spirit, and to which of them was more noble, and to the issue of true aristocracy. But there was no clarity, no order, not even of a dualistic militant sort, for it was all not only contradictory, but also topsy-turvy, and the disputants not only contradicted one another, but also themselves." Quite a nice general critique of the history of dogmatic philosophy. Here, as Hans Castorp begins to come into intellectual maturity, begins to think for himself, we can read the novel in the genre of the Bildungsroman, the German coming-of-age story. Sarah Danaeus is right that if we do this, we must pay attention to how Mann turns the tables, that, as she says, in the classic Bildungsroman, time is a mere medium in which to move from one experience to the next. Time marks out distance traveled and propels the hero forward until eventually it is time to return home, at which point temporality freezes into an eternal now. However, in the Magic Mountain, she says, the tables are turned. Time is no longer a mere function of space. Meaning can no longer triumph over time. Rather, time now trumps meaning and offers itself as the ultimate existential question. Hans had achieved theoretical distance over his homeland by going to the sanatorium. He had subjected himself to the discipline of the sanatorium, learned its ways and customs, which helped him achieve perspective on his past ways of life. He had become a student of competing ideologies while at the sanatorium, but still, as questions concerning the nature of time maintain him an anxious distance from his social engagements, he is continually distinguishing himself, individuating himself in his position toward his interlocutors, ironically quipping that, quote, he saw that the disputants would have been less embittered if during their dispute each had not been the harasser of his own soul. They were their own problems. Their own being was an issue for them. Thomas Mann writes, time is the element of narration, just as it is the element of life. It is inextricably bound up with it, as bodies are in space. The Magic Mountain provides the opportunity to reconstruct a narrative of doing philosophy, of asking questions concerning our own most being. Hans oscillates between being highly individuated and losing his individuality as he is caught up in various social and institutional entanglements. He breaks from his home life, distinguishes himself against that background, that history, becomes one of those in the mountains, a patient, a student, submits himself to these disciplines, is lost in them, awakes suddenly in the midst of this new collective, breaks again, distinguishing himself again against this new history constituted in the sanatorium. Time keeps him unstable, decentered, washing over him, blurring and erasing the traces of his identity until he rears up again and takes a breath, clearly defined again against the histrionic stream. We are never just a face in the crowd, but we need the crowd so that we might have a face. The more heterogeneous the crowd, the more radically individuated we might potentially become. The more homogeneous a crowd, the more radically individuated we might potentially become. That is why, in a totalitarian state, the slightest infractions begin taking on monumental significance, or, under systemic racism, in which race distinguishes absolute kinds, simple gestures such as sitting at a lunch counter or in the front of a bus become historically explosive. There is always a call to action. Authentic acts are always a little rebellious because they call into question the authority of the neuter das Man, onto whom we would shrug off our responsibility. The acts of individuals touch upon anxiety because they are risky. They pose a subtle threat to the smooth operation of a world taken for granted. As this quiet rebellion, the possibilities of being authentic will only open within an underground discourse that remains self-consciously parodic of the canon in the sense discussed above, in the sense that it discloses a vision of interconnectedness. In closing, I want to turn to Camus' paradox, his paradoxical new individualism, the new individualism based upon the we are in relation to history, but I will make this return through Foucault, who argued that there has been an inversion in the hierarchy between take care of yourself and know thyself, which were two principles of antiquity. From Descartes to Husserl, knowing oneself constitutes the fundamental principle and serves as the foundational step toward building a theory of knowledge, whereas in the Greco-Roman world, according to Foucault, self-knowledge arises as a consequence of care for the self. For Heidegger, our self-knowledge arises from the care structure, from Dasein taking itself as the object of inquiry, an inquiry that seeks after one who has themselves inquired. Thus, in a break from Husserl, Heidegger reconstitutes the ancient hierarchy wherein epistemology becomes constituted only on the grounds of a fundamental ontology that has interrogated the self in terms of being in the world as a basic element of the care structure, and therefore as a basic gesture towards any care of the self that could result in self-knowledge. Dasein's nervous disorder can then be interpreted as the diagnosis as a need for self-care. The dis-ease of an anxious Dasein breaks the dominion of the disciplines of society, a discipline that is nevertheless necessary, regardless of how we may be subjugated under its dominion. The disciplines of social life co-determine our individuation along with the care of the self, manifests here as the underground discourse, the discourse that takes up the orthodox discipline of the canonized past, and through our particular mode of parody, appropriates and reimagines philosophies of the past in order to establish a new philosophy for the future, and thus to establish the new individual. I have attempted to illustrate this process both in my analysis of the Magic Mountain, as well as in my treatment of the relationship between Heidegger and Kant. In imagining philosophy, either in the reimagined past or in imagining for the first time, we are imagining ourselves anew through a dialogue with the other. Meditating on the history of philosophy then reemerges as a technique in the care of the self, offering both a break from and a chance to reform the social disciplines we engage every day. In the end, I am, not because I think, but because we are. I am only in dialogue with the history constituted by the temporality of the we are, and only then am I the constitution of the condition of the possibility of thinking, of imagining, of doing philosophy again and anew. In this oscillation between myself and the other, in this between, my rebellion, the no of my deliberate refusal, implies a yes to the discipline appropriated and reformed in my acts to which the other now submits or does not submit. There, in the interplay of refusal and submission, I can find myself again, but for the first time. Thanks.
Okay. We don't have an official moderator, so the floor is open for questions. And I'll leave it up to Donovan to respond to the hands that go up. Please, not all hands at the same time.
Thanks, Donovan. That was truly an essay of philosophy and literature. So many great texts that you brought in there. And I'm really happy that you brought in Notes from the Underground, which was one of the first texts that was relatively philosophical that I read when I was like 16. And I think at first it had a pretty negative effect on me because I took the narrator as a hero, kind of like Rousseau, in The Stranger, right?
Uh-huh.
And it took a while before I had that turn of perspective and realized that no, not heroes but anti-heroes. But then when I started to read Heidegger and was still reading Dostoevsky, I wondered if Heidegger had read Dostoevsky, and I still don't know the answer to that. I think probably not. Maybe Professor Schrag knows the answer to that. But anyhow, I'm wondering if the underground is a scene for ontology, as it were, and you had this narrator in dialogue, perhaps with Heidegger, do you think that the underground man would see the search for the meaning of being, the general meaning of being, as a kind of crystal palace, as that's used in the text? And if so, how would Heidegger respond to the underground man in terms of that critique?
Mm-hmm. So this is sort of following on my general dissertation, the direction of those researches into literature as the scene of ontology. I think probably because of the formal nature of Heidegger's, especially in Being and Time, the underground man probably would see it as a crystal palace. Heidegger, 2 and 3, I guess, would respond to that and say, well, art and history offer other ways of thinking that aren't crystallized, that are more fluid and maybe even have to be experienced, can't be understood in the sense of Kant's understanding or something like that. I wouldn't entirely be surprised if Heidegger had read some of this stuff. I mean, he seemed to be a reader, someone who read a good bit. So I wouldn't be shocked to learn that, but I don't have any evidence to say that he for sure read Notes from the Underground or anything like that. I think it's really striking that the Magic Mountain was published in 1920, 4 or something like that, and it has all these questions about time and everything. So I'm wondering about Heidegger's general relationship to modernism there. So yeah, I think that there's a lot more work to be done in terms of putting these two works into dialogue with one another. And again, just to repeat, yes, I think that Underground Man certainly would see Being in Time as a kind of crystal palace. Because you just can't get at, this is like a cry into the dark, right? You don't get any of these answers. You don't get the meaning of being at any point in time. You're just a problem and you're sick, crippled and all that kind of stuff for the underground discourse. So, and I'm not sure though, I'm not sure that Heidegger entirely disagrees with that. There's a part, and I think it's in Contributions to Philosophy, where Heidegger says that it's practically insane to expect that anyone would actually like take the leap into like really doing philosophy and questioning the meaning of being. It's so hard and upsetting and difficult, and it undermines all of our beliefs and our comfort and everything. That to expect anyone to do it is just like sort of an outrageous expectation to have. So, yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, but
On the relationship of Heidegger and Dostoevsky, yes, he did read Dostoevsky along with Pascal and Kierkegaard and Pascal, Kierkegaard, when he was at Marburg in the 20s. But I don't know of any references to Dostoevsky in his published works. But there are now these 60-some volumes that have not yet been examined, so it might be there. But was one of the points you were aiming at in bringing Dostoevsky and the Underground Man into play here, because of the, if you will, the vision of the Underground Man related to orthodoxy. Can you say a little more about that? Because that's how you introduced Dostoevsky. Was by referring to the etymological meaning of orthodox, upright, straight. True in terms of correctly corresponding to what it said. So were you making the connection that, now this is a nice explication of Heidegger's criticism of the traditional metaphysical understanding of truth as correctness? The Underground Man, with his arms akimbo, says, let's tear the whole damn thing down. Then referring, of course, to the great Crystal Palace.
I'd definitely read Dostoevsky as inaugurating that sort of modernist turn to criticize like the things that had gone before in terms of their formalism, in terms of like their correctness, the representational structure of like we just read truth off of the world and everything. And certainly Mann is taking up that kind of call as well. And George Simmel is talking about the crisis of culture and culture outstripping the individual. So I definitely, in my reading of the history of literature and of philosophy, position Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard as the sort of the clarion call that now this is like not only is it not tenable, but it's just visibly crumbling around as the world rapidly modernizes and the Russian Empire undergoes revolution and the world wars occur and all of this kind of stuff happens. And I think Heidegger is very much attuned to that. And I tend to think that his philosophy is in part a sort of response to this, some of these historical developments that like, look, this just isn't, we can't give ourselves over to this total kind of like calculative thinking and total correspondence theory of truth. So I definitely see a close affinity between Heidegger and these thinkers on this issue. And so certainly what makes the Underground Man sick, well, he can't do it. He doesn't submit to any of these orthodox ways of thinking. He shrugs them all off and is crazy and disheveled and does all of these sorts of, makes all these upsetting statements about his own character and nature. He doesn't fit in anywhere. That's why one of the things that makes him underground is his inability to fit into social spaces in any sort of recognizable way of the time. Certainly.
So I have a question about parody and where parody fits in. Parody. You said parody goes along with this underground discourse, and sort of bouncing off what you were just saying, it sounds like the Underground Man, it doesn't seem to be parodying. It seems like the Underground Man is incorruptible, or at least in his own eyes, right? So where does parody come into the idea of underground discourse? How are the two related?
So parody comes into the idea, parody not to be applied to the underground man, but to Heidegger, what Heidegger is doing with Kant,
Right.
and what we're doing with Heidegger.
Right.
Because parody, I don't mean parody. Linda Hutchin is a literary critic and is formal. She does a lot of work on postmodernism, and actually she's done some work with John Duvall, who I study with in the English department, and she looks at parody as a way to take up and incorporate the past. So by taking on a sort of ironic distance from it, you're able to, you don't reify it and you don't like set it up on a pedestal. So like when Heidegger, and he says this in one of the prefaces to a later edition of the Kant book. He says, I'm always accused of doing violence to Kant. My interpretations are always told I'm doing violence. Well, the reason is because he's trying to do work with Kant. He's not trying just to tell you what he thinks Kant said. He's trying to tell you partially what Kant said, but also to take Kant and then use Kant as a philosophical tool to advocate, as he says, for his own question. So he's not really giving you a straightforward interpretation of Kant. In a way, he's sort of parodying what Kant says as a way of appropriating it and transforming it into a new kind of philosophy. So I don't mean parody in the sense of like goofy and making fun of or at the expense of something.
Right. But what I'm trying to get at or trying to figure out is the relationship between parody and what you call underground discourse. Are these the same? Are they intimately related? Are they things you can take apart?
Yeah. Parody operates within the underground discourse to provide us with this kind of distance from things, so that we don't enter into the canon with the canon as some reified object that we always like must submit ourselves to and seek for like the proper interpretation. But the canon then becomes, because we have this ironic distance under parody, it's something that we can then appropriate and use and make anew. Maybe do violence to it.
And what do you say to people like Rosie Bergogi or others who would say, you're just echoing them? You can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. You're just echoing them.
I'd say they don't know much about building houses. I mean,
there is a genuine critique.
Yeah. Whenever you build, or you can rebuild a house, you can move it, you can refurbish the inside, you can redesign it, you can use parts of the inside to build a new. You want to knock out a wall and put in a breakfast bar and all kinds of things. So if you're going to use the metaphor of construction and house building and stuff, I think you ought to be very careful how you're going to use that.
But go back to parody. I mean, I'm using the concepts. You say I'm not reifying them, but I'm taking them up.
Right. Yeah.
I'm reapplying.
Well, they're not sacred. They're not something that you can't mess with or touch with. They're not something that you're always trying to get to, like the truth in the veritas sense core of like this is what Kant meant. And if you asked Kant, he would tell you that this is like, yes, that's what I meant. That's the correct thing. I think that's what reification does whenever you look at the canon that way.
Yeah. Is that so? Is there a difference between reconstruction and parody? Like, I mean, if I were to, I could, give you a reading of Kant that Kant would be appalled by, but I would use all his words, and I would, maybe preserve some central concepts and jettison others. Right? That seems like a reconstruction, not a parody.
Well, I mean, a parody, I think, would be the tool, and a reconstruction would be the goal. Yeah. I'm looking at parody as like a conceptual tool.
Right.
A conceptual apparatus within our philosophical toolkit.
Because, I mean, some people take up parody in a more, like, to parody is to criticize. It's like when you teach your kids something, right, and then you hear your kids say it, and you're just disgusted by what you hear coming out of your kid's mouth. Or, like, Judith Butler talks about drag queens, right? That's one way of talking about parody. But that sounds not at all like what you're talking about.
I don't think that's completely incommensurate with what I'm talking about. I'm trying to pick up some more specific point from Linda Hutchin, but I think obviously Heidegger's critiquing Kant.
Okay.
I mean, I think there's obviously...
But when he does it directly. He doesn't do it, he says, Kant was wrong about that.
Right, yeah. But then other times he's like basically taking up the Kantian project and moving forward with it and trying to establish something new with it. So, I mean, he does sort of straightforwardly criticize Kant, and he does sometimes take up Kant and sort of turn him a little bit. But in a lot of ways, I think he's very genuinely trying to carry the Kantian project forward, like with earnest. I sought in Kant an advocate for the question to the meaning, to the question I was asking.
So he's not making a joke out of it.
No. And I don't think Linda Hutchian means parody, being parodic as a joke.
Yeah. Or showing its insufficiency.
Yeah.
I mean...
Well, but it does those things. Like, I don't think some of the things you're saying are mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Kant, for Heidegger, Kant is both insufficient and also necessary.
Yeah.
Like, you need Kant, but Kant's not going to get you there.
Yeah. And to me, that sounds like reconstruction more than parody, but this might just be a specific
Sure.
idea.
Kind of along those lines when we're talking about reappropriation, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between textuality and alterity that you were talking about to begin with, because it seems like when we're using parody as this way of taking up previous texts and rebuilding them into something that's more along the lines of the project that you're looking for, that's a strict conversion to the same rather than a move toward the other. And I'm wondering if I'm just like missing something there. If you could just say a little bit more about what you're getting at.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by a strict conversion to the same?
Because you're using the words of the other to build something that's your own entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not a question of like, let me go to the other so much as it is, let me redo my own.
But in going to the other is shaping me into another that I'm not yet.
Okay.
That I will become. There's no strict, from my view, and maybe this leans heavily on like my previous work, there's just not a sharp distinction between myself and the other.
Yeah, no, I can agree with that. Yeah. I just wanted to see where you were going from with. So is it just a move out and then a return?
Yeah, I like an oscillation. This is a concept that I'm sort of developing right now that I don't know exactly how to articulate fully, and it comes from Heidegger's talk of between, like this oscillation between different things as a way of, and this is a great concept in theoretical physics, right? This oscillation. I don't know how to fully articulate that yet formally, but it's a way of capturing again that idea of instability or dis-ease, and that state of being in between. So that we're not stuck with a sort of dichotomous way of thinking between self and other, difference and identity, all that kind of stuff. Because I'm told that identity and difference is not like the thing anymore in philosophy. But whether or not we accept that judgment, I know Chris Yeomans thinks that era is sort of over. But,
yeah.
So I'm trying to think through some of those same issues in different terms, maybe, and trying to break down the dichotomy a little bit between self and other.
Okay, so for you, like, let's say here's self and you're other, because I'm the one talking. so the reading is going out and the rewriting is coming back.
Yeah.
That sort of possibly.
Yeah. Because as you bring the other back to yourself, you're reshaping yourself into some other that you're not yet, that you'll become, right? The other that I myself am. Okay. So. Max.
So this goes back to something from you and Brian's discussion. So part of the goal, it seems like, is to be able to take up these philosophers and be able to reappropriate them in particular ways. And there's different ways of doing that, and there's different sort of methods that we can use. But the goal is to find things in there that are, kernels of truth or something like that to get us to where we're trying to go. I'm wondering, how important is it to maybe first get a grasp on the sort of canonical understanding of these thinkers, or to, as you guys were saying, right, get a grasp on what it is that we can say, as best we can, that if Kant were here today, this is what he would say, or if Heidegger was here today, this is what he would say. How important is that as a first step to being able to then do the work of parody and these other things, or is that sort of becoming more superfluous, or is that still going to be important?
Super important.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's your entrance into the Orthodox. If you don't have that, we wasted a lot of time in school. Yeah, I think it's really important. I don't ever want to suggest, maybe sometimes I don't mind if I give the impression, but I don't want to actually suggest or seriously think that we don't have to try to sort of get at the text and what the text is saying. That's always going to remain important. And it's going to just remain important so that we can talk to one another. Like, if I want to talk to you about Kant and I have something new to say about Kant, it's going to be important that first we're both on the same page about Kant. And then I say, well, like last semester when I was arguing with Dr. Marinia about Heidegger, like first it was like, okay, so what do we think Heidegger is saying? And now here's like my interpretation of what Heidegger is saying. And I think that this is a better way of thinking about it. So yeah, I think that's really, really super important. Although at the same time, as important as I think it is, I also think it's kind of impossible. Like the whole problem of authorial intent. I mean, just, but that in and of itself, that impossibility makes this kind of like taking up an appropriation possible because you're not locked into like whatever it is they said.
The only other thing I was going to say, so sort of that's going to be our necessary first step is to get down to just generally what we think these people are saying before then we can take up their thought and do something with it more or less. Isn't that then really, really hard to be able to distance ourselves from that? And is there perhaps an even more effective way to create a distance than this parody that you're talking about? Or do you think that the parody is going to be sort of one of our best tools for wrenching ourselves away from this sort of strict interpretation?
Definitely a methodological pluralist. I think there's a variety of ways to go about it. I think they're all hard, though. I don't think any of them are easy. I tend to agree with Heidegger that it's kind of like insane to ask people to like try and do this thing.
Yeah.
Like, why would you? Oh, why don't you just pull the rug out from under yourself? That'd be fun. Yeah, no, no one wants to do that, right? So, I think that no, this isn't the only way. I think it's a pretty good way because it's helpful and I think healthy, since we're using a disease metaphor. To keep a distance from. I don't think it's ever good whenever a student is in class and says, this text is the gospel. And you're like, oh. Okay. I didn't realize we were in a theology seminar. I always think that's kind of problematic. So, yeah. But again, I'm certainly a methodological pluralist. And that's something that I think I talked about a little bit at the conference. Like, it's not just one comedian that does this certain thing, or it's not just anxiety. I mean, although in Being in Time it's anxiety, there can be other ways to get at it. And maybe I'm appropriating and changing what Heidegger says when I say that, but that's what I think is the case.
So. How much would you recognize the danger of a kind of reification of parody itself, or a reification of this way of thinking of, it seems like I have this problem a lot of times with postmodernity, is where you start getting into these interpretations of text, and then it kind of all of a sudden gets to a point where people say, yeah, but you can't get to what the text actually says anyway, which seems to be used as almost a kind of way of getting out of the anxiety of having the responsibility of trying to interpret the text well. And then kind of goes back to this kind of they self of our times now, where it's no, that's not the way things are. There's no way to have an absolute access to anything. And so we can kind of lean up on that, right, without this responsibility or anxiety to then understand things in the way that they are. And this kind of gets back to what you're talking about with Brian, too, here, this idea that the question of whether we're merely trying to destroy the Crystal Palace or whether we're trying to use the materials to build something new, recognizing what they were in the first place, right? There has to be something about that part of the palace that is, I'll use the Heideggerian, disclosed, right, in itself. In order to be able to be used for something else, right? Which seems to grasp some sort of truth there, right? Something about it that maybe wasn't even recognized by the first master craftsman, right? But still something there nonetheless, right?
Since I made a parodic gesture about the ends of things in philosophy and the end of the end, I think that postmodernity is ending, if not over. I'm over it. I'm an advocate of truth. I think truth is important. So whenever I say I don't think that we can get to, like, it's not that we can't get at what the text is saying. The text is saying something, the words are there. They can be repeated, they're objective, and they appear the same to me, to you. The words themselves, right? When I say that we can't get to what the author is trying to say or what the author's thoughts were, that's more of a problem of like the distinct, like the separation between, you know, different persons in time and history and all that kind of stuff. That actually makes me more anxious. That doesn't make me feel safer or better. That makes me feel more anxious about it, because it would be very comforting to think that I could just turn to someone and say, well, what did you mean by that? And they would just disclose to me the absolute truth. However, I think that there is a limit to what the text says. So yes, are there multiple interpretations of a given text? Yes. Is there unlimited interpretation to a text? Absolutely not. I've read like literary now. So I read this essay one time that Faulkner's Go Down Moses was about this big flood, and it was this book about like the exploitation of the southern ecology by northern, all this kind of stuff. And not only did they say that that's what the book was about, but that's what Faulkner meant. And I've never read like a more ridiculous attempt to interpret a novel in my life. Like I wonder if they read the same book I read. And like, are there ecological issues in Go Down Moses? Yes. But how in the world do you make the leap to this being like, and then claiming that that's what Faulkner meant by it? So I think that's bad interpretation. I just think that you are not following any kind of criteria for what would constitute like a good or bad interpretation of anything. You're just saying whatever you want to say and using the text as a foil for your own agenda. So that is one of the things that I think is important about this oscillation between myself and the other, because I'm always going to be kind of kept in check by something. And I'm going to keep others in check as well. So it's not as if it's just like a free-for-all. There's some criteria for interpretation that is mostly determined by what the interpretive tool that you're bringing to it. So certain things are going to be, it's like what Aristotle says at the end of, this is one of my favorite, I say this all the time, people have heard me say this dozens of times, I know. At the end of book 2 of the Metaphysics, Aristotle has this thing about learning how to take each kind of argument and having an ear for discerning what kinds of arguments are good for the same thing. And I think that's true of art and of interpretation and of methodology as well. Never has there been more sound advice given to philosophers than that.
It's the beginning of ethics too.
Yeah. So, and Derrida, and at the end of an essay, the end of subjectivity, or the ends of subjectivity, he talks about the double threat of deconstruction. On the one hand, you risk completely jumping outside of the system and then merely reformulating the system in different terms. On the other hand, you risk just remaining inside that system and moving furniture around so that you never actually deconstruct or critique anything. So the actual goal, the authentic goal, we might say, of deconstruction is to walk that line between both breaking beyond the system and recognizing what within the system is useful to take with us as we break outside of it, and not making some radical leap beyond. So, and that's at the very last 2 pages of this essay. Yeah, that's in the Margins of Philosophy. The End of Subjectivity, I think it's called. So, is that helpful?
Yeah, it's helpful. I just wonder. It seems like to me, Heidegger wants to, rather than undermine, undercut. And that means that, one thing you said was Heidegger undermines correspondence theory of truth. And I don't know, you didn't really explain what you meant by that word undermine. But it seems like to me that he doesn't want to say that it's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to say that the correspondence theory of truth requires these conditions for the possibility of its occurring.
Yeah.
Right? And so that means that I'm not even discussing the systems, whether I'm creating them or reformulating them or moving around within them. I'm discussing the conditions for the possibility of doing any of that, right? Mm-hmm. And so then there's both a virtue and a danger there, right? I like to use the analogy. Everybody's stuck in the building analogy and the palace analogy, right? That one of the things that Heidegger is trying to do is take the pieces of the building and build a boat to navigate the mystery, right? It's no longer I'm looking for a foundation, right, and build a building. I'm looking for a way to navigate through and disclose different things to me, right? And it's fluid.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wonder how much then the very idea of doing this kind of undercutting rather than undermining can then itself become a system, right? I'm sure we've all read Heideggerians who are just stuck in the language of being in time, for example, right? And everything is interpreted in that language. And it seems like there's this way in which the dis-ease can become an ease, right? And that this idea of whether I feel anxious and the community back and forth is this kind of phenomenological criterion is a strange one too to me. Like if everybody else doesn't feel anxious and I do, then they're right. Certainly we wouldn't want to say that, right? But then if somebody says, hey, I feel anxious about this, and in the way that Heidegger means, and it's disclosing these possibilities, and I'm like, well, to me it just looks like you're hiding from responsibility, right? How do I differentiate? Does anybody's anxiety trump anybody else's, right? There seems to be all these issues at play here.
Okay, so let's go to the undermining a bit about correctness. So in Contributions, Heidegger says that correctness is an ineluctable scion of truth. So he thinks that correctness is unavoidable. Like you have aletheic truth, but you're gonna get correctness at some point, right? It springs out of it. But one of the problems with being in time is you risk a sort of reductio, right? Because he's trying to do a fundamental ontology, which means that he's trying to build some kind of like an aletheic version of truth that then correctness would rest upon. But then, well, what are the conditions of the possibility for aletheic truth? And then what are the conditions of the possibility for the conditions of the possibility of aletheic truth? And the conditions of the, you know what I mean? So you risk that. One of the ways I think he tries to escape this later is to flee language and basically say we have to cross being out. Being is a necessary word, but it's insufficient for the things that we need. Like, we can't really talk about it. We can talk around it. We can talk metaphors. There's art that discloses this to us. I think these are all ways Heidegger tries to get out of that sort of reduction of, like, formal systems. And I think this is something that's going on widely at the time. You have the problem of induction in Bertrand Russell. You have Gödel's incompleteness theorem as a critique of the Principia that is talking about prime consistent sets. I think it's just something that's widely happening at that time. So now what's the resolution to that? I like the boat metaphor, right? Like, I think that's good. So where does it ground out? Again, I think that you're always laying the foundation. I think actually that's one of the strengths of Heidegger's like projection forward is like that you're always having to like re-substantiate yourself like in terms of history and all that kind of stuff. In terms of other people's anxiety, trumping other people's anxiety, I wouldn't want to say that, but I don't know how I would like test. I don't know how I know if other people's anxiety is authentic or not, or whether someone else is being authentic. I think maybe I can know if I am, but I'm not sure like on what grounds I would judge the others like being authentic or not, or their anxiety. So I guess maybe I would want to back away from saying that any one person's anxiety trumps us, other than to sort of practice a hermeneutics of suspicion and just always be skeptical of people's claims about that kind of thing. And, you know, if I knew someone really well, if I was intimate with someone, I think I would have better grounds. Because, again, that interplay of our histories together would, levels of individuation between myself and the other would be reduced to more. That is something I'm still working through and I'm not sure about. I think it's a good question. My ultimate strategy would be to try and turn the discourse away from talking about whether or not someone's anxiety is trumped by another's. But obviously, I'm not the arbiter of these things, so I don't know how to respond exactly to that one, other than some of the approaches I just sketched.
Do you think Division 2 of being in time puts into question?
I'm louder.
Do you think Division 2 of being in time helps check certain worries about where you brought up about
the sort of theoretical framework is being unproblematically disclosed, as it were.
The theoretical framework as being problematically or unproblematic.
Yeah, as not being subject to regress or being put in its sort of conditions being put into question by Division 2.
I think Division 2 makes some movements in that direction. But he's still stuck with what he did in Division 1. So I think it's heading that way, and I think very likely that this is why the other divisions never appear.
Right.
Although the work that he does in those two, I mean, the Kant book and the Basic Problems of Phenomenology, for all intents and purposes, basically outline what he had planned to do in the later two divisions.
But then you think that his later work that sort of responds to those worries, do you think it then begins in Being in Time?
Oh, yeah. I do not think that there's some kind of a radical break. I think you can see nascent in Being in Time some of these ideas. And when you read these little bits where he comments on Being in Time, when he talks about like some of the problems that he sees there, it's very clear, at least to me, it seems clear that he very much wants to continue dealing with those issues and using, I mean, even in the 50s, in a 56 lecture, he returns. He's still using being at hand or ready to hand and present to hand. He still will go back and use those distinctions again. He might recontextualize them, but he's still very happy with some of the theoretical tools that he developed in Being in Time. He seems not to make any grand gesture of disavowal, but definitely I think he recognizes the limitations of the project, limitations of phenomenology partially, but also just the limitation of building a system about the fundamental nature of truth.
Right.
I just think he thinks that in the end, like that's not going to be possible.
Yeah.
So poetry and history and things will help. But yeah.
We still have a little time left, do we? Could you tell us a little more about what Mann is up to when he suggests we think of time as a secret, as a verb rather than a noun, and as an element of narrative. Now I think this gets to the heart of a problem that anybody who's working in philosophy and literature has to deal with, yeah. And as you know, this became an important issue for particularly the literary critics and their use of narrative as the topic for investigation, leading to the charge of pantextualism in the literary critics themselves and in the philosophers who use the narrative concept or form or format or idea. And then there's the classic statement by Derrida of grammatology, which there is nothing outside the text. There's nothing outside the text. To which my former classmate replied, Hubert Dreyfus, not a hell of a lot in the text either, but you go through grammatology. But and then there's a different story on narrative, and it recurs to the volume Time and Narrative. And also in Foucault, it's interesting that you move here from Mann to Foucault, because in Foucault, narrative is not something that has to do primarily with an analytic of textuality. It has to do with a constitutive structure of the self. And in the essay referred to the taking care of the self, the care of the self, one of the later pieces that he wrote, and in his essay, Écriture de Soi, the self, well, understood in terms of writing. All right, that's a, if you will, a more a more explicit philosophical way of approaching it that leads ultimately to an ethic. All right, the title of the book is The Ethic of Care. So, right, care of the self as an ethic. So you don't have that in the playing as narrative plays itself out in terms of the tradition going back to Saussure and the semiologists. So it'd be helpful to see what role narrative now plays in Mann's description of time as an element of a narrative. Mm-hmm. Is this time understood grammatologically, or is this time understood existentially in some sense?
I think it's understood existentially. Oh, in the beginning of the book, he talks about time being measured by travel. So, like, we think time is different when I travel on a plane, or well, not a plane for Mon, but on a train or on a horseback, or if I'm walking, time is very different, right? A day's travel becomes very different things. As the text move on, time contracts and shrinks depending upon what's happening on the mountain, depending upon what's going on with Hans Castorp, whether or not somebody's died on the mountain. And he makes like meta-narrative gestures about time regarding like, okay, so now time's going to go much faster than we're accustomed to it, but that happens up here on the mountain, because of all of these different things. So I think that it's definitely sort of in an existential sense, and not strictly about writing or about the text, like sort of itself. There's a weird... The Magic Mountain is an interesting book to use because Mann himself has quite an ironic sort of stance on everything that's going on, like in his characters in that book. So nothing is too close or personal, and there's some pretty interesting moments about like Hans sees his hand under an X-ray and sees the skeletal structure under there, and then he has this like moment of realization of his own death and everything, and then time comes back up again at that. So the short answer there is existential. Part of the role that then it plays in terms of writing the novel, and I think modernism and certain texts of postmodernism are pretty good at doing this, is showing through narrativity the existential experience of time, how it wears on people and changes people, how history develops. This is one of the reasons I'm so interested in Faulkner, is because he develops this whole county with this history and all of these relations, and those relations determine the identity of the characters. And their time is used as a narrative device, surely, but it's meant to disclose a kind of existential truth about time. About how people suppress things, about how people build dynasties and fail to build dynasties and things like that. I think probably one of my aversions to some of postmodernism is that I just don't feel like it takes issues like that seriously. Especially now, for a moment, let me just focus on postmodern novels. One of the things I don't like about postmodern novels is I feel like they're always kind of winking and nodding at the reader, like, oh, we're playing this game, we're playing this language game, look how clever I can be, and I can refer to all these things and do all this. When I read modernism, when I read Faulkner or Mann, they seem really earnest. Like they're not really winking at the reader as much as they're like, really, it's upsetting. So then when you move to postmodern philosophy, I feel like not as obviously as in the novel, but sometimes postmodern philosophy feels like it's doing the same kind of thing, that it's not being so serious. And this is not true in the cases of I think that there are exceptions to this rule, which is why we still read Derrida and read Foucault and read, Deleuze. Although Deleuze is super playful sometimes. I mean, sometimes Deleuze reads and you can tell there's a kind of mischievous language game going on there. But a lot of the people who took up Derrida and took up Foucault and sort of ran with it seem as though they want to avoid taking responsibility for saying something solid, right? Like they're afraid that if they say something solid, then somehow they've submitted to being imperialistic, or they're falling into logic traps, the trap of the totalization of logic and things like that. And I just don't. It seems to me that at the extreme, in the worst cases of that, people are sawing off the limb they sit on, right? How can you make an argument without relying somewhat on some kind of logic, even if it's a logic that you're admitting to constructing? Like, this is what we do in modal logic and things like that. We admit, like, look, I'm constructing a system to do a certain task, and these are the axioms, and those axioms rest on suppositions that can't be proved within the system. So I think that a little bit is bound up with sort of my general critique of postmodernism as aversion or evasion, is a better word, of the hard problem of really saying something that you can be taken to task for, which doesn't work because then people get taken to task for not saying anything. So narrative is something I take very seriously, and Recur, his work on narrative, and particularly in what he does a little bit later in Oneself as Another, as being constitutive of identity itself. Not merely that my identity, it's not sort of like the more banal idea that my identity is merely a story I tell about myself, but that my history is like the enactment, like the performance of the narration of my life, where I am sort of co-author with all the other actors in it, right? I'm not merely telling a story about myself. Like, I am really, in a deep and robust sense, the story of myself, which means that I'm changing all the time and I'm not stable, right? He has that great discussion of the idem and the ipsa identity. I take that much more seriously than the constant referral to the text and to textuality.
Okay,
that's helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful, yeah. But that is a main issue that anybody who deals with postmodernism has to deal with.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, Patrick?
Are we done? Is it done?
Yeah. We'll give you some more time.
Oh, okay. No, because it's a follow-up to this.
Sure.
Because I have wondered and Recur, and I've read Time and Narrative and really enjoyed it. But I did always have the question, when you think about narrative understanding and how deep that goes, which is about as deep as you can go, it's not just an explicit narration of your existence. Is it one and the same as what we might call an existential understanding of self? Yeah, or not, or should we differentiate those two? I don't remember Recur ever trying to make that distinction, because I think he wants to go, it goes all the way down, narration does.
Yeah.
Do you have the same understanding?
I have a very similar understanding. I read Recur very much as sort of like growing out of, but much beyond the sort of existential framework.
Yeah, he says that himself.
Yeah, and I think he's worried about getting pigeonholed sort of like in that category. And I think that's why he does things like in Memory, History, Forgetting, he starts talking to these analytic philosophers. He's talking to like Galen Strawson and Bernard Williams and people like that, which is great and super productive and something that should be done more, something that I would like to try and do more myself. But I think still he is rooted in that sort of existential line of questioning, and that's what his hermeneutics is sort of about. Like, you constantly have to reopen toward the object of inquiry, and the problem of double meaning and the conflict of interpretations, right? He talks about, the goal of hermeneutics is to constantly reopen the question back toward the object of inquiry, so that you're not really ever going to get, that's why the narrative is open-ended and ongoing, is because you're not going to get like down at the very root bottom, right? But that doesn't mean you give up and you stop trying and that you can't say anything. That just means that you sort of got to hedge a little bit and be tentative and make claims, but then be willing to revise them when, conditions change, or if you want to use a science language, when you have better evidence. I think that's a wise tact. But I like Recur a lot, so I'm a little deferential. Maybe I've reified him a little bit.
Okay, we don't want to impinge on Ryan's time,
Okay.
so let's have our break, and we'll come back with the